Welcome all to the last lecture of today. It is by Jaleh Mansoor, and it gives me great honor and pleasure to be introducing her. She's a friend and a co-conspirator. And also, she's an associate professor in art history department at UBC. Jaleh, as you can see from the program, she's a historian of modern and contemporary cultural production, specializing in 20th century European art, Marxism, Marxist feminism, and critical theory. She worked as a critic for art form, and she frequently contributes to October, Text zur Kunst, and the Journal of Aesthetics and Protest, among many others. Jaleh has written monographic studies on the work of Piero Manzoni, Ed Ruschka, Agnes Martin, Blinky Palermo, Gerhard Richter, and Mona Hartoum. She co-edited an anthology of essays addressing Jacques Rancière's articulation of aesthetic bond to politics, and it's entitled Communities of Sense, Rethinking Aesthetics and Politics, which Duke University Press published in 2010. Her first monograph is titled Marshall Plan Modernism, Italian Post-War Abstraction and the Beginnings of Autonomia, and this was again published by Duke University Press in September 2016. There she explored the procedural violence in the work of Lucio Fontana, Alberto Burri, and Piero Manzoni as an index of rapidly reintegrating labor to capital relationship in the context of European reconstruction. Currently, her current project traces the historical and structural entwinement of aesthetic and real, or concrete abstraction, where abstraction is understood as the extraction of surplus value valorized on and by the market. And she's currently, following this, working on a book, and it's tentatively entitled Concrete Abstraction, the work of art in the age of mechanical labor, which I'm very much looking forward to read parts of it. And I think she's going to give us a little bit parts of that today, maybe. Also, she is the recipient of a 3-year Shirk Insight Grant with her collaborator, artist Dana Claxon. And please join me in welcoming Jaleh Mansoor.
Thanks so much, Sanem, for that very thorough introduction. And I, of course, fully reciprocate the honor of being a partner in crime to you. I should just say that the title of that forthcoming project is Art After the Age of Mechanical Labor, because I'm trying to think through many of the shifts in the particular nature of the labor-to-capital relationship in our post-industrial freefall. And I'd also very much like to thank Samir for the generous invitation to share this work. It's brand new work. I don't know that it's brave new work. It's in its initial incipient stages. It's in tender formation, and I very much welcome your feedback. But first, I'd like to acknowledge that we are convened on unceded ancestral Coast Salish territories, and that should structure and form and inform everything that we're doing here today. So thanks to you both. All right. So the title of this talk is Readymade or Made to be Ready. That is a title of an artwork by Dana Claxton that was on view at the Odein Gallery a couple of years ago. That's in part thinking the relationship of indigeneity and industrial labor. And the second half of the title, after the part that I've thefted from Claxton, is Social Reproduction and Autonomy in 21st Century Art. So I will begin there. In June 2001, Spanish artist Santiago Sierra collected 133 men to take part in his project for the Spanish Pavilion at the 49th Venice Biennale. Sierra's action, entitled 133 Persons Paid to Have Their Hair Dyed Blonde, took place on the opening day of this auspicious Art World event. Sierra directed 133 persons to an area in the Arsenale where he had where he bleached their hair, producing a visibly artificial appearance, in effect, marking each person as though with a yellow highlighter. The criteria in selecting the 133 men were as follows. They were to originate from Africa, Asia, or the Middle East and have dark hair. The participants were immigrants and refugees, legal and otherwise. The self-assigned role of the artist was to manage, direct, and process these persons. The yellow-headed 133 then dispersed, returning to their everyday activities, predominantly illegal street vending on and around Piazza San Marco. The paid volunteers took no part in determining the unfolding of events, nor did they become actors in a production. They had no role in driving a narrative forward or delivering content. This was not that kind of performance in scare quotes. The logic of the action was predicated on the suspension of agency of any kind on the part of these 133 persons, as denoted by criteria set to the lowest denominator of physical characteristics pegged to racial and ethnic alterity. Acting, understood as either the delivery of dramatic content elaborated within the framework of theater or situated in the fact-bearing framework of documentary practices and reenactments, or framed as explorations of agency, as in actionism or neo-avant-garde explorations of task performance, was demonstrably irrelevant to the situation. Any delivery of a subjective or situated interpretation of the circumstances were eclipsed by a demonstration of the objective social relations and determinations enabling the scenario, namely the global state and market relations setting the basic condition for the very possibility of what was happening at Venice, namely the Biennale. An educated liberal art public, one that congregates every 2 years in Venice, was put in the position of having to confront a social reality principle. The charm of the city, the sophistication of the 49th Biennale itself, could not prevent poverty, uneven global economic conditions, and the legal juridical uncertainties of exclusion and biopolitical control from literally erupting and dispersing into the visual field in a way at once incidental, banal, and spectacularized. As may be expected, what psychoanalysis calls the reality principle is met with any number of equally transparent defense mechanisms. A critic for Le Monde, among others, described Sierra's work in general and his plan for the 2001 Venice Biennale in particular, the result of a, quote, unpitying cynicism. One may have noted that the messenger was being blamed for the message, or better, for merely remarking a message that is always already in the tourist's face, besmirching the picture. Meanwhile, various social agencies called Sierra's use of refugees inhumane, despite the fact that the artist worked with refugee organizations. An admittedly minuscule fraction of that putative public, those who have contributed to the discourse on Sierra's project, is polarized between those who see him as exploitive and those who see him continuing the 60s legacy of negative critique and the unmasking of capitalist ideology. Needless to say, the present paper disagrees with both of those positions and is trying to beat a third path into the problem. The majority of Biennale visitors reacted with shock and disdain for what they perceived to be the abusive opportunism of Sierra's tactic. He paid the illegal workers very little for their participation, and yet this parsimony begs the question, what could ever be an adequate exchange rate for an inscription over the body willed by another agent? Could there ever be compensation for the men's extreme vulnerability to the law, to the fact that they were risking their own place in networks of black market survival in order to legitimate and lend value to Sierra's proper name, probably unbeknownst to themselves? Sierra's work, whatever its aesthetic interest may or may not be, and in full acknowledgement of its failure as a critical art practice, much less a social intervention, does beg a few urgently necessary questions about art and work in contemporaneity. I'd like to use this work as a jump-off point from which to ask what resistance, that horizon of social justice with which art is so frequently and unfortunately tasked, would look like in the situation Sierra forcefully highlights. Indeed, what relationship artwork could possibly have to exploitive labor outside of or other than its complicitous reproduction. Visibility itself became the work's primary protagonist. While it literally highlighted heads, the cruelty of Sierra's gesture highlighted a much wider structure of habituated, systemic brutality. The global exhibitionary order founded on transient bodies, bodies contingent on and vulnerable to abstracted social relations generated by an ever more complexly mediated liaison between capital and labor. Now, as the political scientist Timothy Mitchell, who teaches poli-sci at Columbia and is very much piggybacking off of Edward Said's project, as Mitchell has argued, this exhibitionary order, and exhibitionary order is his language, not mine, was inaugurated in the World's Fairs of the mid to late 19th century, starting with the London World's Fair of 1851 and running through the Exposition Universelle in Paris in the 1860s and 70s, and forges the matrix for numerous art world fairs and biennials in this, our contemporaneity. So that moment is the matrix for our present moment. My intervention is that the capitalist metabolic extracting value from bodies and resources and mediating it in the social and cultural field has changed all the more to stay the same, to maintain hegemony. The manifestation of the exhibitionary order distributing bodies, goods, and services has therefore also changed the more to maintain hegemony. But how might we trace this etiology? How do artworks clarify, if not prefigure, capital's flight from core to periphery on the one hand, and the shift from surplus value productive labor to revenues generated by the service and gig economy on the other? So two movements, sort of centripetal and centripetal, both of which I think these works are strangely prescient in noting. How and why have we moved from anxiety of surplus value to that of surplus populations? For a forthcoming project on concrete abstraction, which is to say the biopolitics of abstraction in the social field, I trace 5 instances within canonized, and I emphasize canonized art practices of the last century that thematize, or better, that formalize the otherwise invisible because omnipresent and naturalized, symbiotic link between social reproduction, production, and artistic creativity in order to locate nodal points of interruption and potential social autonomy, autonomia. These works trace a trajectory from the 1880s to the present, but my study moves in historical reverse. Oops, those were 2 more images of the World's Fair and the Exposition Universelle in Paris from 2 centuries ago. So, my study moves in historical reverse, from Sierra back to the crucible of the late 19th century marked by Mitchell and others, in order to trace a genealogy. After Sierra, or the first figure would be the artist collective Clairefontaine, who've been working from 2006 to now, who take their inspiration from art historian Carla Lanzi's Rivolta Femminile and the Italian automatist feminism of the years of lead, when the worker-led bid for self-determination and autonomy reached a peak articulation. Then, of course, again, Santiago Sierra, specifically his work from around 2000 and 2001, whose cruel and demonstrably, patently unethical practice dramatizes and perhaps I'd argue that cruelty itself becomes the medium. The class war inherent in racialized, stateless, surplus populations in the context of the Keynesian state's collapsing social contracts. And then Merrill Lederman-Ukeles, whose 1973 manifesto entitled Maintenance Art Manifesto, addressed in advance what Rosalind Krauss calls the post-medium condition, in its turn to performance, in parallax to a changing economic base that emphasizes service and affect work over manufacture or production. And then Yves Klein's Living Paintbrushes from 1960, in which models were ordered to dip their naked bodies in paint and press up to receptive surfaces in a gesture that collapses humans and things and emphasizes the contracted service over the final result. So the Living Paintbrushes took place in the context of a series of performances entitled Anthropometrie, and the work is located much more in those performances than in the resulting works, although they too hang on the walls of MoMA right now. Then the next figure, moving in reverse order, is Francis Picabia, whose Mechanomorphs from 1915 first introduced the collapse of subject and object, allegorized in portraits that portray not people, but people as tools and machines. And finally, or firstly, Georges Seurat, who attempted to grasp labor at the level of the grapheme. The uncanny and exemplary way in which these artworks locate, identify, and explore forms of gendered and racialized capture, insidiously foundational to artistic praxis, form my selection criteria. All of these practices have entered the dominant narratives of 20th century art. The questions I ask through and of them have not. The artist may be one of the last subject positions within capitalism to determine their own production under the sign of, quote, creativity, and to be held at an oblique angle to value productive labor. They are dialectically free, in massive scare quotes, to be creative. And here I'm relying on a whole genealogy of writers, from Adorno to more recently Marina Abramovic, Kirsten Stegmaier, Dave Beach, John Roberts, and others. But since 1973, if not 1915, if not 1888, when artists were summoned to fulfill a creative capacity, they deliver on this demand by indexing forms of reification that have migrated from the domain of the object to that of the subject, to the artist's subject. Now in the 21st century, heightened in a post-industrial era of quote-unquote feminized and immaterial labor, where service eclipses production. And we might note here, because I'm reticent of these various forms of this language that's been set into circulation in the last decade or so, we might note that capital flight from core to periphery has ushered in a new language, an era of new jargon. So-called dematerialization marks the shift from value-productive manufacturing to precarious and feminized labor. And I want to note that it's Lucy Lippard who in 72, 73 talks about the dematerialized work of art with relation to conceptual art. But of course we know in hindsight how terrifyingly misinformed that notion of the dematerialized work of art is, mostly because there is no such thing as dematerialized labor. In any case, artists in the post-medium condition formulate practices that track parallel to the as-yet undefined service economy, and yet continue to be mythologized as agents capable of delivering exceptional experience, an experience institutionally deemed to be specialized, singular, and free. I was going to kind of fold in an ad lib discussion of this artwork by Blake Rain. I'm not sure that time will permit. Suffice it to say that Blake Rain, who is a contemporary practitioner who makes frequent visits to Vancouver at the invitation of the UBC Art and Art History program, but Rain's tactic, his kind of conceit, if you will, is to take the assignment at face value and turn the assignment into a work of art, working within very narrowly circumscribed parameters. So this work is entitled Folder and Application. Folder and application, that kind of language is already spoofing white-collar labor and the artist's inscription into a certain kind of labor of information. But as you might see, he's working within these very narrow, predetermined limits, the alphabet, and working and reworking those basic ingredients in order to try and forge something that could be nominally new or nominally creative or nominally breaking out of those narrow parameters. So it's no surprise that this artwork is more or less filling out Adorno's notion of the work of art as that which is simultaneously exceptional and inscribed within the prevailing order. But so, moving on to what I'm trying to do, my project ultimately seeks to locate the post-human turn not in the internet era of the 21st century, nor the cybernetic turn of the last mid-century, which is usually dated to 1948, but in the surplus value productive crucible of the 19th century, where I also locate abstraction, both real and aesthetic. And maybe I should stick to this image for the moment. This becomes a problem of both ontology and epistemology, caught in the glitch between Heidegger and Marx, between Dasein and the absence of any such term in materialist dialectics. To quote Sami Khatib's essay on the thingishness of modernity in the volume Aesthetic Marx, edited, of course, by Semir Gendesha, quote, "In capital, there is no Grundwesen, no foundational grounding essence that could be concealed, reified. But, on the contrary, the objective thingish mode of concealment itself has become the essential feature, the Grundwesen of society," end quote. So what I take from Khatib's very eloquent formulation is that it's the social relation itself that is the technology. The social relation is a techne of replication and reproduction, as the value form comes to be as autonomous as the signifier. This is part of his argument, the autonomy of the signifier and how that works as a kind of homology and analogy to the autonomy of the value form that comes to determine all social relations and not the other way around. But the question remains, how did this thingishness move from the actual things mediating social relations to the becoming thingish of all subjectivity and experiential life? A mediating category here is performance. To this. But although it is set into circulation to denote any number of art practices involving human actors and agents, very few of those practices entail performance in the sense of theater or expression. Most of them explore the human as non-agent, a cipher to structure. And we could think, for instance, of Yvonne Rainer's charge against Marina Abramovic in 2011, that basically her medium is exploitive voluntarism. So, I frame the present argument against existing discourses that posits all performance art as inherently liberated, and therefore above the fray of any antagonistic exploration of existing racialized and gendered class relations as they are daily reconstituted. To discursively frame the project, my work engages and disagrees with Nato Thompson's thesis in Living as Form, which came out in 2012, that embodied participatory art is necessarily emancipatory. And while it aligns in spirit with Claire Bishop's Artificial Hells, which also uncannily came out in 2012, it parts ways with her at the level of both method and ultimate conclusion. What Bishop sees as a merely problematic idiom is in fact part of a structural determination, a social technology both implicated in and constitutive of the organic totality of capitalism. Yet the silver lining to being part of this structural determination is the capacity to propose ways of interrupting that totality from within. Sierra's practice, exemplary but by no means exceptional, again Adorno's language, stands alongside other recent projects such as Francis Alice's 2002 artwork entitled When Faith Moves Mountains, featured in his 2008 retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art. Now, in this work entails 500 unpaid volunteers who shoveled sand in the hot sun until they collectively moved an entire dune by a few inches. This takes place in Lima, Peru. Again, volunteer labor. Both projects require the viewer to limn the dissonant relationship among the meanings of the word work, artwork, wage labor. Labor in this context is especially fraught. It cannot be described by either the classic Marxian narratives of proletarianization, nor the terms of critique or resistance we have inherited from the socially engaged art of the present. With the obsolescence of these narratives comes the obsolescence of that regime of visibility, those conditions of social visibility. So again, visibility was itself part of the set of problems the piece at Venice highlighted among the highlighted human heads. But this act of visual emphasis is not synonymous with exposure or unveiling. 133 persons framed that which the visual regime of the exhibit in 2001 both depends upon and dismisses, the uneven value of the human. Sierra is not making the traditional Enlightenment or Habermasian argument that transparency will save the day. Because the work that Sierra and others of his generation do is responding to a social fabric organized by forms of both transparent control and opaque disciplinary orders. That which is isolated to view is not hidden any more than the hidden abode of production is actually hidden. Or it is hidden in plain sight, in the visual landscape, and yet absent in the mind of the citizen consumer. But this absence to consciousness at stake in much Marxian and Frankfurt School discourse is no longer a matter of making the unknown known. Exposure is not the point. The open secret of asymmetrical human value within capital is what's at stake. The uneven value of human life, the social relations attendant therein, and what it means to make art in an age of austerity and restructuring in the aftermath of the Keynesian state comes under scrutiny, part of the total social picture. The problem of interchangeability brought to bear by the ultimate commodity that is labor power under a new and young industrial modernity has transitioned now to mass disposability, or at least mass disposability from the point of view of capital, the mass disposability of people. And this is where Marx and Agamben have much to say to one another, despite the antagonism among various nouveau, neo-readings of Marx, and on the other hand, biopolitics. So let us return one more time to the scene at the Arsenale in Venice in 2001. Whatever the good intentions on the part of artists, curators, critics, viewers, and culture industry workers at all levels of rank and file, many international megashows willfully, if unconsciously, scotomize a set of geopolitical and economic conditions upon which the entirety of the art world, this art event in particular, depend. While we've heard a great deal of late about art in relationship to social justice, and I could rattle off any number of proper names, Tanya Bruguera, Pablo Helguera, Grant Kester, Yates McKee, Nato Thompson, I mean, there are dozens of these projects that are often organized around the theme of participation. And whatever one may make of the notion of autonomy, the social justice turn in art mistakes cause and consequence, failing to account for the foundational transition in the shifting internal dynamic, the shifting internal metabolic of capital itself, as it moves again from core to former peripheries, requiring different forms of extraction as it goes. And in capital flight from core to periphery, leaving in its wake new kinds of economies, which are being popularly called the gig economy, or the Uber, or the Airbnb economy. More specifically, this kind of discourse, the social justice turn, does not factor the unfreedom of labor, legal or illegal, into its narrative of injustice, nor its definition of justice. Overlooked is both the source of wealth in value-productive labor, however out of sight and mind, and the circulation of this wealth in the ever-widening labyrinth of global finance, and the way in which the violent social de- and recomposition demanded by capital both deracinates and reintegrates social relations globally. Above all, renaturalizes new social relations. Art fairs, however much a product of the 19th century, located these days everywhere and seemingly nowhere in particular, are especially reticulated to the phenomenon of globalization, although no account of this intimate relationship has been offered as of yet. In order for the relationship of the artwork to the social field it negotiates to begin to be understood, much less appropriated into the critic's own political agenda, its relationship to the source and circulation of its own funding must be accounted. Now that the global and systemic structure of capital, or what old-school Marxists might have called base, has changed so dramatically, the lines of mediation between it and culture must also be redrawn. In other words, given that the economic reconfiguration on which culture depends has changed so drastically, why are there so few accounts of the restructured global labor relationship and about the global underclass in writing about art and social justice? So that the whole kind of Marxian set of questions are completely missing from this enormous, burgeoning body of social justice literature in writing about art. So moving along, the question of the global underclass, in turn, becomes also a question of surplus populations, those bodies deemed disposable because no longer structurally necessary to capitalist value production. This project then relies on existing scholarly literature, especially that of Beverly Silver, but also many others, among them Vivek Chibber, Alberto Toscano, on the emergence, the conditions for the emergence of a global underclass, and the related but non-identical rise of a surplus population generated by the de- and recomposition of local demographics to fuel capital, yet to remain within the dictates of the IMF UN mapping of global geopolitical order. So the kinds of state-to-market relationships that figures like Brenner or Giovanni Arrighi have done a lot of labor in mapping now have to turn to a kind of world systems discourse, which I think Beverly Silver is especially at the forefront of, although she doesn't care about art. The hope is to suggest that artists such as Sierra and Claire Fontaine do not take up the problem of labor from the perspective of ethics or an interest in social reform, which were inherited from which might be seen to be inherited from the progressive cultural practices of the 60s, but rather as a structurally inevitable, necessary condition of art making and exhibiting now. This structural condition acts as both limit and spur to the very possibility of making art in the 21st century. It may be helpful to, along these lines, to make the point I'm trying to make, to differentiate Sierra's project from the now canonized models of art making whose continual reception contributes to its misrecognition. So the artist that Sierra is compared and contrasted with the most is Daniel Buren. So I'll talk about Daniel Buren for a moment. Already in 1968 in Paris, Daniel Buren had set into action the relationship between remuneration, art, and personhood. A group of sandwich men wore boards on which Bjørn's idiomatic white and colored stripes were painted at the equally idiomatic, and you can think about branding. Bjørn is singularly brilliant in turning abstraction into branding and branding into abstraction, which is a kind of important prequel to what happens next. His idiomatic 8.7 cm intervals. So this part advertisement, part artwork, unmasked commodification of the human. This is an unmasking kind of project, which I think is very different from what Sierra is doing. After Marx, the perennial question of the commodity and its expropriation of subjectivity has been posed repeatedly, beginning with Siegfried Krakauer's Little Shop Girls Go to the Movies and Walter Benjamin's poetic exploration of 19th century Parisian arcades, in which homeless proletariat, which he calls the clochard, worked as living advertisements, blurring the line between animate and inanimate. Bjørn's clochards literalize Marx's observation that capital structurally renders subjects objects by making people contingent on a wage relation in which they cannot afford the results of their labor, nor the time in which they labor, and objects act like or are perceived as subjects due to the mystification and power of the commodity fetish. These men perform the paradox of circulating the central and most visible social message of capital, the advertisement, while themselves remaining invisible. Although it would look as though Bjørn were onto something more fundamental than the role of the museum as such, the work has been understood as part of the critique of institutions, in which art practices took their own institutional condition of possibility as a problem to be explored, without looking further into the role those institutions played in relation to the capitalist valorization process. One possible exception to this is Hans Haacke, who came closest to trying to locate the relationship between museums and money, but again, as Vered Maimon points out in her study of what differentiates the Sierras and Pierre Huyg's generation from the May of 1968 generation, is the insignificance of any Enlightenment aspiration. Ideology critique by the time of Sierra is beside the point. The former public sphere is now saturated with an excess of analysis and no way forward. So what I'm saying is that if the 68 generation was about offering some form of transparency, some form of analysis in the service of enlightenment, we now have a surplus of that form of analysis and nowhere really to move with it. Sierra's framing device supersedes those of the critique of institutions by shifting emphasis from the institution, understood in Bjørn's time as an ideological apparatus, to microcosms embedded in and reproducing the larger system of circulation that is dependent on changes internal to the capitalist mode of production. I think the shift from manufacture to service is really what Sierra and friends, let me return to that again, are pinpointing. This is a line of inquiry begun by Duchamp in 1915 and yet more or less masticated by numerous generations who let the problem of labor fall by the wayside. So this is why this is being picked up by artists in the 21st century, a more or less 100-year deferral. Sierra's work is not critical of the system it analyzes, but does provide adequately stark demonstrations of the degree to which very little differentiates working conditions in modern liberal democracy from the same depiction of pre-modern economies it believes itself to have replaced. If anything, Bjørn's practice happened at the very moment capital was about to reconsolidate itself after beginning to free itself of the social buyout offered by Keynes-inspired worker compensation packages, such that that cultural critique merely became a form of mediation, allowing capital and labor to be ever more deeply integrated. Or as Mario Tronti has noted in his recent, he's sort of piped up again recently, in his essay in the New Left Review in 2001, he notes that May of '68 was a cultural revolution that deflected a much deeper form of restoration and the reconsolidation of capital. At around the same time as Buren's interrogation of institutional authority, so so I've talked about critique of institutions, I'm talking about the present generation, but I'm also going to very briefly talk about the generation of minimalist artists who fully identified with this kind of mythological notion of the robust male industrial factory worker. At around the same time as Buren's interrogation of institutional authority, a number of artists were explicitly identifying with the worker. As Julia Bryan Wilson has shown in her magisterial Art Workers, the rise of New Left social movements in the 60s in the United States saw a number of artists, such as Carl Andre and Robert Morris, and here Richard Serra, actively conjugating work, as in art, with work, with wage labor, in a relationship of creative agency, one based on a model of the subject is capable of willfully moving from the subject position of the artist to that of the worker and back again. Questions of identity and appropriation aside, this contradiction, or naive theater of identity, occurred at the very same moment that theorists of the work of art were declaring the death of the author, while at the same time theorists of class consciousness and revolutionary history began to posit the intellectual worker, the student or the artist, as an agent of historical change in lieu of the factory worker. And again, you can think of the barricades in Paris in '68. In both cases, the worker and the notion of work underwent radical historical changes that put the very word work under extreme pressure. The politicization of artistic labor, in short, happened at the very moment, tragically, dialectically, that labor itself was changing, such that the artist was bound to identify with a vanishing subject position, literally and figuratively. Robert Morris, for instance, stated that, quote, matter is matter rather than a symbol is a conscious political position, I think. It is essentially Marxist, end quote. This is quoted by Teresa Schwartz in Art in America in 1971, and again surfaced in Art Workers. The trouble is that precisely that model of literalist materialism and literal deferral to the worker happened when the worker subject, evoked by Morris in numerous images of heroic physical labor, was disappearing. Paradoxically, as I have argued elsewhere, the logic of seriality and recursive structure with which these artists were engaged were themselves symptoms of a logic of value production yielding to a new model of capitalist integration predicated increasingly on de-skilled labor on the one hand and outsourcing on the other, which starts between 1968 and 1971, which is when the entire steel and glass industry moves from Appalachia to East Asia, which, if you read interviews with Richard Serra, ends up factoring into his process, which is why, for instance, the torqued ellipses of the late 90s had to be made at a special processing plant in China. So there's a weird way that this tracks parallel. The wish to elaborate a practice which eliminated or diminished the artist's hand and substituted it with factory production was already behind the changes taking place, which was the elimination of the worker altogether by moving the locus of labor to places where labor was not protected by the same regulative system put in place by the welfare state established during the 1930s on the one hand, and the financialization of capital on the other hand, both of which place the onus of reproducing hegemony on the consumer, not the worker. Morris neither acknowledges the duress of the hero worker in the early 1970s, nor does he destabilize the value system. In hindsight, Morris's gestures are not only piteously touching in their identification with a subject's position, soon to become purely mythical, the robust worker, but truly melancholic for an entire era in which it seemed possible to locate class and the very subjects of revolutionary class consciousness in the worker subject, a nostalgia whose reactionary undercurrents we have seen in full force in the last couple of years and in the demographic that supposedly voted for Trump. Morris defers to the vanishing worker in much the same way that Walter Benjamin, in his discussion of the fishwives at New Haven in A Short History of Photography, notes that the flash of the camera illuminates the bourgeoisie at the moment of its disappearance, at the moment of the disappearance of this class as a coherent entity. So I pick up that notion of dialectical obsolescence at the very moment that it enters into culture and apply it as a critique of Brian Wilson's reading of art workers. The artist's identification with the heroic factory worker throughout the 1960s on both sides of the Atlantic, and Manzoni is implicated in this as well, is especially, as I said, tragic during this moment of incipient globalization, and globalization on the one hand, and turn to finance in the core on the other. So, I'm about to wrap up and give you a sense of what the rest of the project consists of before breaking for questions. So, while Sierra explicitly cites minimalism as the origin of the artistic problems he inherited and from which he works out his own idiom, Clairefontaine folds the reference to minimalism into their practice as well. So they have this critical spoof of Carl Andre's bricks as emerging from a space of manufacture. All right. I'd like to explore what relationship art making and the gesture of striking, which had been Robert Morris's own last gesture, his art and worker strike in 1971, what relevance they might have from the vantage of the present. Given the metabolic rate of late capital in general and the velocity of circulation in its cultural arm in particular, the general strike has come up in the kind of floating language, floating discourse in numerous art fairs and biennials in the last 5 or so years, in numerous clearinghouses of cultural production. The biennial, the art fair, the convention-type exhibition, etc., all of which are modeled on the World's Fairs of the late 19th century, when Paris and London were undergoing rapid modernization in keeping with the laws of value. Clairefontaine, the collective whose gestures are often included in these same international art circuits, claims the tactic as one necessarily impinging on art making. In their text entitled Readymade Artist and Human Strike, a few clarifications, the collective confronts the problem with startling frankness, only to conclude that at this historical moment, quote, the only way of assisting creation is to protect those who create nothing and are not even interested in art, end quote. This declaration on the collective's part may strike us as extreme, and of course to echo a dictum that cultural practice has heard only too often in the era of endgames, in the era that marks much post-World War II poetics and aesthetics. It recalls Adorno's claim that there could be no lyric poetry after Auschwitz, for instance, which makes it all the more imperative to try. The latter, Adorno, made the case for why literature had to resist its own verdict, and concluded with the insistence that it was all the more crucial to practice a form of lyricism to push against the prevailing order of total domination and cynicism. If anything, this lent lyricism a historically motivated urgency, a greater necessity than before. But Clairefontaine's suggestion that there can be no art under capitalism is also striking for how it fails to echo so many modernist prohibitions. The claim is not that art is not possible out of an ethical or existential stance, as though a form of protest were to withhold one's artistic genius. No, on the contrary, the collective elaborates their point rather more carefully, developing an argument rather than issuing a statement. The text does not function like a manifesto. Instead, it makes the case that the very conditions under which the making of a work is possible has come under extreme duress in the shift of reification from object to subject, where the product that is meant to be delivered at each artist talk, each art fair, each exhibition is not the work of art, but the artist themselves, the work of the artist as sort of spectacular theater. It is simply not possible to make a work, which doesn't mean that we won't all keep circulating as though it were. So I leave you with the word strike, which is the only teeny-weeny little vector out of that condition, at least as Clairefontaine located. Thank you.
Jaleh, thank you so much. Before we get to the questions, there are just very quick things I would like to say, which for me, I think it's amazingly important for you to emphasize capital as social relationship. And it can be the artist also who can enter into that social relationship and who can turn a body into a labor power and be incredibly exploitive about it. And I know you don't want to use the word exploitive, but I think
it is a good word. I'm just going to grab a pen so I can jot down everything that you're saying.
Sure. So social relation itself is the technology. In that sense is incredibly pertinent, I think, in your case. And in relation to that, it is also something that I also picked up from your talk, which I would like to highlight, is that the thing about visibility and invisibility shouldn't be addressed through exchange and through transaction, which some of the critiques of Santiago Sierra was doing, precisely by highlighting whether or not this is an exploitative relationship, and what would happen if, for instance, we keep on giving more rights or more money to the workers, which certainly, and I do want to echo you when you say that it is worker compensation packages where actually they reconsolidated the capital. And in that sense, I have two quick questions. You don't have to answer them now. Maybe these are part of your genealogy or not. But what if the artist was also toiling with the laborers? So, for instance, what if Francis Alice was part of the laborers who were shoveling the earth? And I'm asking this precisely because we have been talking about in the morning about making poetry, and how making poetry is making collectivity itself, it's making width. So would it change the conditions, or would it change the meaning of the artwork? Or would it be part of your genealogy where the worker's body is turned into this thing? And secondly, would one's use of one's own body be another point in your genealogy? So in this day and age where artist as the creator, in a quite somehow also narcissistic manner, in the fact that they don't, this whole question of social justice is never addressed. Do you think those performatives can also be a point in your genealogy? As I'm saying, like, you don't have to answer them now. These are just some of the things that your brilliant talk, I have to say.
Oh, thank you. Since you ask, I could and would answer that no matter how the artist positions herself or himself as a sort of equal player alongside the bodies that are being exploited, no matter how much the artist tries to situate himself in a condition of relative parity, obviously that position is, I have to speak carefully and not, swear and drop F-bombs, and that is a really narcissistic, self-mythologizing gesture. And the key figure there would be Thomas Hirschhorn, who, for instance, his Bataille monument in Kassel in 2002 at Documenta, where he'll fly in somewhere and set up, for instance, a photography and video lab and work alongside the local youth who are otherwise totally dispossessed and produce something of that and make of that his own artwork, and then he'll sort of fly off to the next destination, which would be, for instance, the Gramsci Monument in the Bronx in the summer of 2013. So although I think Hirschhorn likes to see himself as a worker alongside the workers that he herds, that's a very pretentious and tendentious position that isn't I don't think valid. Then there are figures like Marina Abramovic, who, because much of their work, especially their early work, involves their own body, that earlier practice comes to operate as a kind of carte blanche or Hail Mary pass for new forms of exploitive voluntarism in the present. That too just won't and doesn't pass muster.
Thank you. Samir and then Philip.
Thanks so much, Jaleh. That was a wonderfully rich and also, I think, quite provocative talk. So a number of things that came to mind, and one was the Francis piece that you discussed. It really drew to mind this piece by Zhang Wan, the Chinese artist. He has a piece called To Raise a Mountain by a Meter. It was done in 1995, and I think that might figure in this talk at some point as well, because you have these basically a stack of about 10 living naked bodies that are literally raising the mountain by a meter. It's quite extraordinary, and I think in the constellation of pieces that you discuss, it might fit quite nicely. I'm not sure I agree with Khatib. I mean, it's a great essay, but I think he's too negative insofar as the grounding essence of capitalist social relations is precisely what is absent, which is the possibility of human species being. And I think that's what actually retroactively grounds a critique. Otherwise, you have no foothold to critique capitalism as a set of social relations. I think that's really important not to lose sight of. And one of the key aspects of the constellation of his thinking is Zonrettel, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Zonrettel, of course, is important for you because you talk about real abstraction, concrete abstraction, and of course he's also somebody who's theorized the division of mental and material labor, and I think this is intellectual and menial labor, which is really, I think, important in your project here. So this is where my question is coming from, and that is that there's a weird kind of a temporal gap, isn't there? I mean, 1967, Saul Lewitt and his paragraphs on conceptualism, right? That in a way harken back to that moment, exactly 50 years earlier. Duchamp's gesture, which in a sense establishes the institution as that which must be critiqued, right? That which must be at least foregrounded and brought into visibility. This was already, in a sense, a gesture towards a discussion of immaterial labor, really at the very height of American industrial power, manufacturing power. So there seems to be a kind of lag here, a temporal lag, where there's a kind of anticipation of what is to come in the very at the very basis of the rise of the United States as a global hegemon based on its industrial prowess. So how does you talk about abstraction in terms of visual abstraction, Seurat, and so on. But where does conceptualism fit in? And you talk a little bit about minimalism, but what is the role of conceptualism? Because that ties it then back to Sohn-Rettel, right? That concepts are themselves premised upon this division between manual and intellectual labor. So if you could comment on that.
That's a really, really excellent question, and begins to probe the sort of meta-level problem of the book in formation. The argument is that, so you locate two different glitches. One is the problem of intellectual and manual labor that Sohn-Rettel pinpoints as the origin of abstraction. And I think part of the reason that I even find it useful to conjugate real abstraction with aesthetic abstraction is that I think the artist is a particularly exemplary site for studying this kind of bifurcation of intellectual and manual labor that then structures all of the 20th century, because the artist is caught in this glitch. And this is the very glitch that we're all suffering now. Are artists, the turn to theory? Are artists supposed to be making work in their studios, or are they supposed to be reading theory infinitely and going to the Whitney ISP? I mean, this is every artist's crisis, intellectual and manual labor. The second glitch that you locate, which originates in the Picabia-Duchamp moment, I would speak to as follows. So you have the kinds of arguments by people like John Roberts that Duchamp's work is all about the shift from skilled labor and complex labor to de-skilled simple labor. That's one argument. The other argument by Peter Berger and friends is that the Readymade shifts the onus of artistic agency, or not artistic agency, but agency and determination onto the institution, takes it out of the studio, out of the artist's hands. Now, the meta-level argument that the book is making is that it's precisely because of the dominance of those kinds of Peter Berger-like readings that we as in the historians, the critics, the art theorists, have completely failed to notice the way in which the Dada Duchampian moment is also thinking about the relationship between the base and the superstructure. And the discourse around the critique of institutions allowed us to completely scotomize all of those questions. So the last big art historian who's bothered to think about abstraction as a function of the relationship between an economic metabolic and the cultural superstructure is Meyer Shapiro, who was writing in 1937. Shortly after that, and of course in the post-war period, everything becomes about ideology critique. So the task is to see how ideology critique became itself a kind of veiling apparatus that allowed us to not notice the way in which the artwork presciently traces a relationship to the base, if we would but notice. So I'm trying to sort of trace that back to Seurat and trace conceptualism and minimalism as this pivotal moment when outsourcing and restructuring starts to happen, but how artists kind of on the one hand, symptomatize this, and on the other hand, screen it by pretending to be more interested in other things, the institution, etc.
Thank you.
You know, I think your focus on the World Fair and these base institutions is really exciting, and I wanted to go with it for a second and add global sports festivals into the mix, and then have you fill in a little more about art fairs, which I don't know about, which I suspect. But basically, the World Fair itself, I would say it's the difference between imperial splendor and a nomadic capital. And the World's Fair exposition was essentially about presenting products the products that were being made by industry, but also the problems, the products, and the peoples that were being bought from the far corners of the world to show us our imperium over the earth, and here's the Philippine village, and here are the products we make, and so forth. Yeah. And this was a big thing through Chicago and maybe even through the U.S. World Fair in New York in 1939. But they start to lose money, and by the time Seattle does a World Fair going into the 70s, they lose a lot of money, and they lose any sense of a focus about what they are. They start having Disney come in and doing stuff, and it's a dead thing. And it never occurred to me that that sort of shift to these new things, art fairs and global sports, are sort of manifesting what's happening at the base, which is the end of the Fordist thing. And when you talk about Hirshhorn essentially coming in like capital for a few weeks and then leaving, where you run to a different area where the capital is more often, and the shift is onto the artist rather than the product and the materiality. You think again of these huge sports fests, which must have started to grow about the time that this other stuff died, where they come in for 3 or 4 months to some area in what used to be called the Third World, or they go to Brazil and so forth. They reconfigure the country for a while by raising neighborhoods where workers live and claiming that what they're putting up is going to provide sports stadiums which people can use, and then they go, leaving behind a huge debt. Now, I don't know how art fairs work or when they started to become these mad, large things that they are, and how that everybody has to be there. But they're obviously not sort of mass democratic as the World's Fair was. The notion of who goes to an arts fair is a little different than who would go to the World's Fair and so forth. And I wonder if you talk a little about when art fairs started to grow bigger and become the absolute epoch-making events that they're supposed to be every year in the world of art.
Yeah, art fairs and the Biennale phenomenon are very interesting also for tracing the diminishing importance of the nation state and its yielding to I don't know, the corporate state. So, there's the well-known historical fact that the CIA made sure that Robert Rauschenberg won the big prize at the Venice Biennale of 1964, which just happened to be a portrait of JFK, that sort of thing. So in answer to your question, what one would have to do would be to trace the shift in the art fair from being a kind of place to consolidate national identity, which had been the case during the Cold War, and then after 1989, the movement from the function of the state and ideology into this kind of much more liberal, lubricious, lubricated market situation, which is what we're in now, where we keep hearing, I don't know what the final statistics are, but we keep hearing that these international art world events bring in just as much money as sports events and Olympics. So that, I know Agamben was working on, I sort of lost track of I stopped being a huge fan, reading every single book as it was released a few years ago. But in his work on the tourist industry and its relation to globalization, art fairs and events are the kind of nodal thing, because whether or not mass publics are interested in art, they still go to these as events. So what I would be trying to do, if I were to pursue this line of query, would be to see the fairs of the late 19th century as kind of caught in a relationship between the state and the market. Then the state takes the upper hand in the mid-20th century, and then in the very late 20th century and into the 21st century, again, the market and capital pick up, that become the kind of louder voice.
And it might be good to lose the term globalization and get to the more exact term, like, I don't know, the reign of nomadic cow, or whatever you want to call it.
See, we don't have language yet. That's part of what I'm always interested in, that artists seem capable of circumscribing a set of phenomena, either at the very same moment or a little bit in advance, that all of the poli-sci and the discourse makers are sort of rushing to set language to, but then we all collectively agree that the language is utterly dissatisfactory, if not straight up harmful, like dematerialized labor, feminized labor, globalization. These words are all, they don't do what they're supposed to do, and yet these artworks seem to present a kind of non-linguistic set of, I don't know, signifiers. That doesn't make any sense, non-linguistic signifiers. But yeah, signifiers, whatever their materiality may be, in advance of a kind of functional, referential, denotative language.
Can you?
Hi. So I have two questions. The first is, so the individuals in the art pieces, they're obviously not exercising positive liberty, but as you said, it's not labor in a traditional Marxian sense. Sorry. So I'm wondering if the model or the laborer were able to go to the gallery and find pride in the piece, does this sort of negate the exploitive nature of the production? So if the individuals are able to recognize themselves in the piece and in their labor within the piece, does this negate their sort of alienation? And then my second question is to do with, I think today a lot of artists, they sort of have the idea, and then it's, they can have this idea 3D printed, or a robotic arm can sculpt the piece. So I'm wondering, there's laborers that work with this technology to create these pieces, and I'm wondering if we can compare these laborers and these middlemen to the individuals in the performance pieces.
Yeah, so to answer your first question, if the sort of informal laborer of the, whatever you want to call it, the precarious economy, the gig economy, comes to see the final work and recognizes themselves in the final work and takes pride in the recognition of the self in the final work, does this negate the fact that the work is predicated on exploitive voluntarism? No, it does not negate the fact that the work is predicated on exploitive voluntarism. And 2 points of reference for that. I don't know how familiar you may be with the film version of Society of the Spectacle, but so Debord in the Society of the Spectacle is theorizing the way in which, in the late 20th century, capital is frozen as image and spectacle culture as a form of capture, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, in the footage for that film, you see so many people sort of hurling themselves at the camera and wanting to be part of this process of capture. And another point of reference I would bring up in answer to your question would be Alan Sekula's talking about photography as at once honorific and repressive. So, in the same way that you have people who take a lot of selfies, myself included, knowing full well that social media and Facebook and other such things is just one giant police apparatus, that way of being caught in the glitch between photography is honorific, right? It's your portrait. It's all the sort of narcissisms inscribed in that. And on the other hand, repressive, that was already the case in the 19th century with all of the portrait salons, like the ones by Nadar and Dizderi, and, where people were flocking to have images taken of themselves, knowing full well that the entire police apparatus was also predicating itself on the rise of casual photography. So that's a contradiction inherent in this problem of the capture of the image of the self, going all the way back to Niepce in 1827. I don't think that it makes the work any less exploitive that someone who might have been paid to have their hair dyed blonde would, have a 2-second thrill from seeing the image. They're still rendered vulnerable. They're still, being all the more visible to the carabinieri in Venice, which is vicious. Most of these people are illegal workers who are endangering themselves. So, no, the kind of narcissistic thrill of self-representation does not negate all of the other issues of everything from surveillance and discipline to issues in societies of control, et cetera, et cetera. They're two sides of one coin. The second part of your question was a little bit more complicated. It's interesting because there was an artist talk at UBC just the other day about this problem of creative agency, 3D printing, the sort of large studio practice, et cetera, et cetera. One would have to speak to this on an artist-by-artist or case-by-case basis, but artists have always had large production studios in which they make very little of their art. This is the case from Da Vinci through Warhol to Serra to... The point is that all labor and all production is going under the proper name, which then becomes the brand of the artist. So it's kind of moot who is producing the work or which technology is producing the work.
Following just a second, could you please take the microphone, please? Thank you.
On the previous question, I'm just wondering what your opinion would be of participatory theater type of projects, especially ones that use like youth in trouble, and it's supposed to be empowering, but at the same time it's also exploitive. Do you encourage it? Would you discourage it? Or how can we make it really useful, or can we? And how can we honor those participations, or can we?
Well, I think probably this talk has made clear that I'm deeply skeptical and reticent about those kinds of social work practices. I would say that there probably are one or two or three socially responsible approaches that are few and far between, but all of them, or at least the ones I could think of, involve suspending this kind of nomadic flight where you enter a sort of scene or scenario and you get involved with a local community, and you are very exciting to that local community, and then you orphan them, you abandon them, and leave. So those kinds of practices, which have really grown exponentially in the last few decades, they worry me very, very, very much. But that's different than, say, an artist who founds their own youth outreach group that is permanently situated and that they are permanently part of for life. I mean, that's a level of dedication and commitment that would offset the Hirschhorn phenomenon.
Thank you.
An example, hopefully a kind of answer, is Sharon Lockhart's work. I don't know if you're familiar, but she permanently founds youth groups. And so she went to Poland, and she doesn't speak Polish, but she's spent years with youth girls there and is helping not just help them make films, but to situate herself there to help them develop alternative modes of living so that they're not returning to whatever situation got them there in the first place, as a voluntary kind of thing. Yeah, Sharon Lockhart.
Yeah. So it's sort of the dedication,
Mhm.
the attitude coming in.
Commitment over the longue durée, yes. Trying to give whatever the demographic in question is, the means to their own self-representation. But you can't just do that for a month, which is, most of these works are that kind of thing.
I had a question. I thank you so much for this talk. I really appreciated it. And I don't know how coherent I am at this time of the afternoon, but I've been thinking a lot about similar issues and specifically about Clairefontaine, actually. So I really am interested in some of the claims that you were making there. And one of my questions is about, what you said at the end, with the point about the Adornian point, about the impossibility of poetry after genocide, and in a way, Clairefontaine's work in this whole postulation of the fact that it's the artist, there is no artist, right? And in light of your point about the shift of reification from the object to the subject,
Right.
And
That's
that
the
artist.
primary point. Thank you. Yeah.
What's that?
Thank you for recognizing that that's the crux. So yeah.
Yeah, it feels very important, and I love that point. And I think my question is, I suppose my question is just about some of these gestures, which I do think you're right, there's a certain effacement almost there, or a kind of embrace of the reification. And to me, that raises this question about artistic autonomy and heteronomy, especially in light of your critique, which I'm totally sympathetic to, and have a similar critique of participatory art of the kind that you were just talking about, or Hirschhorn, or there's so much of it, right? That would be really on the side of heteronomy in a way, right? Like the artist is trying to be in society in this way and trying to in a lot of ways compensate for neoliberal, precarity. And trying to perform the work that society and the state no longer perform. Right. And then
social work. Right.
Right, social work. And then on the other hand, stuff like this, is extremely autonomous in a way, in its gesture, I mean, not, in what it's trying to do on that spectrum. And to me, that there's something appealing about that in the mirroring of reification and that, because to me, I'm curious as to what strategies you think actually can respond in that moment. You know what I mean? To me, it's that's a reflection back of shock in the context of an impasse, basically, that they're describing, I think, in that text that you cited. So I'm just curious as to what you think about gestures in that space that could be more critical.
The reason that I'm interested in Clairefontaine in the first place is that they seem to be the only living kinds of carriers of the legacy of autonomia. And the text that I cite relies heavily on a number of Italian feminist texts from the early 1970s, especially the Bologna Women's Collective, where the declaration is made that there has never been a general strike, because if all, not so much the workers who produce goods, but the workers who produce those workers, namely the mothers and wives, were to indeed go on strike, the entire economy would collapse in a nanosecond. And so I think their contribution to the art world is just to sort of insert this thought into whatever interstice they can insert it, precisely because the art world has come to be seen as a place of politics by other means. So they aren't enacting their own position. They are themselves practicing the same kind of hypocrisy that most artists practice, because these are objects that are in galleries and in museums and at art fairs. And yet, the capacity to reintroduce the notion of the general strike in 2008 afterwards is, I think, the horizon of autonomy not in Adorno's sense, although we all misprize that terribly. Adorno was not a proponent of the autonomous work of art in any undialectical sense, but Clairefontaine's autonomy, as in autonomia, I think, is inscribed as the sort of lining that we're all, the sort of lining or horizon to which we're all reaching, but stated dialectically because we aren't there. So that's just how I would kind of qualify the kind of autonomy inscribed in their project, which is a deferred, it's a prefigured one, where the message is a general strike that has yet to come to pass.
Right, totally. I love how you said that. And I think also, I think there are different senses of autonomy in their work in the sense of that it's autonomy that undercuts itself in the capitalist sense, right? The autonomy of the artwork as a commodity, which it reveals itself precisely as a commodity through its appearance as autonomous, and then, so I think there are different levels of it, but yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I think on that note, we can end today's talk, Jaleh's talk, and also today's session.
Thank you.
To be continued tomorrow at noon. And from here, we'll go to... okay, Samir. Thank you so very much.
So thanks for coming today, and as Sanem said, we'll be reconvening here at noon tomorrow for a panel on art, labor, and utopia. And then we have Anita Shari speaking after that, and look forward to seeing you all back. Thanks.